moved to Dalton because I had nowhere else to go. That sounds more dramatic than it was. My apartment lease in Columbus ran out. I had about $400 in my checking account, and my cousin Marcus had a spare room in his duplex off Route 9. He said I could stay until I figured something out, and since figuring something out was the only plan I had, I took him up on it. I drove down from Columbus on a Sunday afternoon in early March with everything I owned in the back seat of my car. It wasn't much. Some clothes, a box of books I kept telling myself I'd read, a laptop that barely held a charge anymore. I'd sold my furniture when I moved out of the apartment because none of it was worth paying to store. The drive was about 2 hours, and I spent most of it trying not to think too hard about what I was doing, which was running out of options at 29 years old. Dalton is the kind of town where the gas station doubles as the grocery store, and everyone knows which cars belong to who. Population just under 2,000. Marcus worked at the grain elevator outside town and seemed content with his life in a way I didn't understand, but envied. He drank beer on his porch after work and watched the neighbors mow their lawns and never seemed to want anything more than that. We hadn't been close growing up. He was 5 years older, and we'd only seen each other at family stuff, holidays and funerals mostly. But when I called and told him I was in a rough spot, he didn't hesitate. That's the kind of guy Marcus was. He didn't ask what happened or how I'd managed to wreck things so thoroughly. He just said the room was available and I should come whenever I was ready. I needed a job. Marcus put the word out for me, and within a week I got a call from a guy named Glenn Parcher. He ran a small contracting outfit that did renovations, tear-downs, junk hauling, whatever people needed. Marcus said Glenn was good to work for, paid in cash sometimes, which I liked. Didn't ask too many questions, which I liked even more. I wasn't hiding from anything specific, but I'd had some trouble with the IRS the year before and preferred to keep a low profile while I sorted it out. I met Glenn at a diner on a Tuesday morning. He was already sitting in a booth when I walked in. A big guy with a thick neck and hands that looked like they'd been breaking things and putting them back together for decades. He had a friendly face, though. Wide smile, easy laugh. He bought me breakfast and asked me what I could do. I told him I'd done warehouse work, some landscaping, helped a friend's dad with drywall one summer. Nothing impressive. Glenn nodded through all of it like he was hearing exactly what he wanted to hear. I don't need specialists, he said. I need someone who shows up and does what I ask. Can you do that? I said I could. Good. You start tomorrow. Be at my shop by 7. His shop was a big metal building on the east edge of town, the kind of prefab structure you see on farms. Inside it was organized chaos. Tools hung on pegboard walls, lumber stacked in one corner, a couple of work trucks parked on the concrete floor. There was a guy already there when I pulled up, leaning against one of the trucks and smoking a cigarette. That was Ray. Ray was maybe 40, thin, with a narrow face and deep-set eyes that made him look perpetually tired. He shook my hand without squeezing and said, "Hey," and that was about the extent of our introduction. I'd later learned that Ray was not a talker. He'd been working for Glenn for almost 3 years and seemed to communicate mostly through nods and grunts and the occasional muttered direction. I figured he was just one of those quiet guys. Some people are like that, especially in small towns. They don't see the point in filling silence. The first couple of weeks were normal. We renovated a kitchen for an old woman on Maple Street. We tore out a rotted deck behind a rental property. We hauled scrap metal to a recycling yard 2 towns over. The work was hard but straightforward, and Glenn was a decent boss. He'd work alongside us, cracking jokes, telling stories about jobs he'd done in the past. He'd been in construction his whole adult life, started when he was 17. He knew everyone in town and everyone seemed to like him. People waved at him from their cars. The woman at the hardware store gave him a discount. The sheriff stopped by the shop once to shoot the breeze, and they talked about fishing for 20 minutes. Glenn had a way of making you feel included. He'd ask about your weekend, remember details from previous conversations, bring coffee for everyone on cold mornings without making a big deal out of it. He paid on time, sometimes early if a job went well. When I mentioned that my car was making a bad sound, he spent 45 minutes looking under the hood after work and figured out it was a loose belt tensioner, then refused to let me pay him for the part. That's who Glenn was to me for those first weeks. The kind of boss you tell people you got lucky to find. I remember thinking I'd gotten lucky. Decent work, decent boss, a place to sleep. Things were going to be fine. It was maybe 3 weeks in when Glenn asked me to stay late. We'd finished a job early that day, a bathroom demo in a foreclosed house, and Ray had already gone home. Glenn and I were back at the shop cleaning up. "Hey, I got a side thing tonight if you want the hours," he said. $100, shouldn't take long. $100 for a few hours of work was good money. I said sure. We drove out to a property about 15 minutes from town, a small ranch house set way back from the road on a couple of acres. No neighbors visible in any direction. Glenn said it belonged to a guy who'd moved away and wanted the place cleaned out before he put it on the market. The house was a mess. Not just dirty, but wrecked. Furniture overturned, stuff thrown everywhere. The carpet in the living room had a huge dark stain on it that had soaked through to the padding underneath. The kitchen was worse. The linoleum was peeling, and there were stains on the countertops and walls that I couldn't identify. There was a smell too, faint but wrong. Sour and metallic, like old pennies mixed with something organic. Previous owner was a hoarder, Glenn said when he saw me looking around. Let the place go to hell. We're just gutting it. Carpet out, drywall out, all of it into the truck. We worked for about 4 hours. I tore up carpet and Glenn ripped out drywall, and we hauled everything to the truck in heavy, awkward loads. The carpet was the worst part. It was stiff in places where the stains had dried, and it crumbled when I pulled at it too hard. Underneath, the subfloor had dark patches soaked deep into the wood. Glenn said we'd come back the next day to pull it up and replace it. Driving home, I asked what the stains were. Glenn didn't look at me. "Dogs," he said. "Guy had like 6 dogs in there. Wasn't cleaning up after them." That made sense. I'd seen houses like that before, places where animals had been left to ruin everything. But something about the stains bothered me. They didn't look like what dogs leave behind. They were the wrong color, the wrong consistency, and that smell wasn't animal waste. I'd cleaned out an apartment once where a cat lady had 50 cats, and the whole place reeked of ammonia. This was different. I let it go. I'm not proud of that, but I did. $100 was $100, and Glenn's explanation was plausible enough that I could talk myself into believing it. We went back the next day and finished the job. Glenn brought a bottle of something he called enzyme cleaner, and we doused the subfloor with it. The smell went away mostly. We nailed down new plywood over the worst sections and called it done. Glenn paid me another $100 and we moved on. Nothing strange happened for the next couple of weeks. Normal jobs, normal days. I was starting to get to know Dalton a little. There was a bar called the Lantern where guys went after work, and I'd go sometimes with Marcus. The bartender was a guy named Pete, who remembered your order after the second visit and kept the jukebox stocked with classic rock and old country. I met a woman named April who worked at the gas station, and we went on a couple of dates. She was divorced, had a young daughter, and was studying for her nursing certification online. She was funny in a dry, understated way, and didn't seem to care that I was broke and directionless. For those couple of weeks, Dalton started to feel like a place I could actually stay. Life was settling into a rhythm, and I was grateful for it. Then Glenn asked me to do another side job. This one was a mobile home on the far north end of the county, way out past where the pavement ended and the roads turned to gravel and then to dirt. The mobile home sat in a clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. No power lines running to it, no mailbox, nothing to suggest anyone had been living there recently. But when we went inside, there were signs of recent occupation. Food in the cabinets, a sleeping bag on the floor of the bedroom, clothes in a trash bag in the closet, and stains. On the bathroom floor, on the walls of the hallway, on the kitchen linoleum, the same dark brownish stains. "Another hoarder?" I said. Glenn looked at me for a second too long. Then he smiled. "Something like that. Same deal as last time." "Got it." This time Ray was with us. He didn't say anything the whole night. Didn't even seem to register the stains or the smell. He just worked, methodical and silent, pulling up flooring and bagging debris. I watched him peel a section of linoleum off the kitchen floor, and there was so much dried residue underneath that it pulled up in strings, almost like glue. Ray just kept working. I found something that night. I was tearing drywall out of the bedroom closet and a piece came away, and behind it, wedged between the studs, was a shoe. A woman's shoe, a white sneaker, size 7 or 8. It was clean, like it had been back there a while but hadn't gotten dirty. There was no reason for a shoe to be inside a wall. I held it for a minute, looking at it. Then I looked at the stains on the hallway floor. Then I looked at the sleeping bag in the bedroom. And I felt something shift in my stomach. A cold, slow turning that I tried to push down. Glenn came into the room and I put the shoe in the trash bag with the rest of the debris. I don't know why I didn't say anything. Fear, maybe. Or the fact that a shoe behind drywall isn't proof of anything. People lose shoes. Houses are weird. Stuff ends up in strange places. That's what I told myself. I was getting good at that. We finished around midnight and Glenn drove us back. He paid me the 100 and told me I did good work. I went home and took a shower and sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, staring at the wall. I kept thinking about that shoe and the way Ray had looked while he worked, like he'd done this exact thing a dozen times before, and it was as routine as sweeping a floor. I started paying more attention after that. Not in an obvious way. I didn't go snooping through Glenn's stuff or follow him around. I just watched. I listened. And the more I did, the more things I noticed that didn't sit right. Glenn had a storage unit on the south side of town. He went there a lot, sometimes late at night. He'd take the truck and come back an hour later without any explanation. He made phone calls he'd step outside to take, even in the rain. And every few weeks, there'd be another side job, always at night, always at some remote property, always involving the same kind of cleanup. I did 3 more of those jobs over the next month. A cabin off a logging road, a basement apartment in a house whose upstairs tenant said she'd never even been down there, a detached garage behind a vacant lot. Every single one had the stains. Every single one smelled the same. And Glenn always had an explanation. Animals, burst pipes, a renter who slaughtered chickens. The explanations got less convincing each time, but he delivered them with such casual confidence that I could almost believe him. The basement apartment was the one that stuck with me the most before the storage unit. The stairs going down were narrow and steep, and the ceiling was low enough that Glenn had to duck. The apartment was just 2 rooms and a bathroom, the kind of place a landlord rents to someone with nowhere else to go. There was a mattress on the floor with no sheets, just the bare stained fabric. The bathroom had no door, and the walls, which were painted cinder block, had marks on them at about waist height, long horizontal scratches in the paint, dozens of them, like someone had been dragging something sharp along the surface, or like someone had been clawing at it. Glenn said it was from the previous tenant moving furniture. I looked at those scratches and I knew that wasn't true. Furniture doesn't leave marks like that. Fingernails do. Almost. I started looking into missing persons reports, not because I had some kind of theory, not yet. More because the alternative to looking was not looking, and I couldn't keep doing that. I used the computer at the library in the next town over because I didn't have a laptop, and Marcus's desktop was in the living room where he'd see what I was searching. The library was small and mostly empty on weekday afternoons. I'd sit at one of the 2 public terminals and search through local news sites and county databases, scrolling through pages of names and dates and grainy photos. The librarian, an older woman with reading glasses on a chain, would glance over at me occasionally but never said anything. There were a lot of missing people in the area, more than I would have expected for a rural stretch of southern Ohio. Most of them were the kind of people who don't make the news. Drifters, addicts, people with no fixed address. A woman named Terry Bowen had gone missing from a town 20 miles north about 6 months before I arrived. A man named Douglas Fenn had disappeared from a halfway house in the county seat around the same time. There were others. I found 7 in the past 2 years, all within a 50-mile radius of Dalton, all people who lived on the margins. That didn't prove anything either. People on the margins disappear for all kinds of reasons. They move, they relapse, they die in ways that don't get reported. I knew that, but I went back to the library twice more and kept looking. I found an article about Terry Bowen in a small weekly paper out of Greenfield. Her sister had posted flyers around town. There was a quote from the sister saying Terry had told her she was going to stay with a friend in the area, and that was the last anyone heard from her. The friend was never identified. The article was 4 paragraphs long and buried on page 6. Nobody was going to make a fuss over Terry Bowen. But the stains kept coming back to me. The smell. The shoe in the wall. I started having trouble sleeping. I'd lie in bed and my brain would cycle through everything, trying to assemble the pieces into something that made sense without making it into the thing I was afraid it was. I'd run through Glenn's explanations one by one and try to make them work. Dogs, burst pipes, chickens, furniture scratches. Each one was just barely plausible enough on its own, but lined up together they formed a pattern that only pointed one direction. And then I'd think about how calm Ray always was during the cleanups, how he never asked questions, never hesitated, never even wrinkled his nose at the smell. That wasn't the behavior of a guy who thought he was cleaning up after animals. That was the behavior of a guy who knew exactly what he was cleaning up and had made his peace with it a long time ago. Most nights I'd fail to talk myself out of it and just lie there in the dark, heart beating too fast, until the sun came up. One night I drove out to the ranch house, the first property we'd cleaned. I don't know what I expected to find. It had been weeks. The place was probably locked up or already sold. But I went anyway, parked on the road and walked up the gravel driveway in the dark. The house was empty. No lock on the door, which was typical for that area. People didn't lock up houses that were being worked on. I went inside with my phone flashlight and looked around. We'd done a thorough job. New subfloor, fresh drywall up in most of the rooms. It looked like a different house. I went to the living room, where the biggest stain had been. We'd replaced the subfloor there with fresh plywood. I knelt down and looked at the edges where the new wood met the old joists. And I saw something. Down in the gap between the plywood and the joist, about 2 inches down, there was a dark residue on the wood that we hadn't cleaned. I reached in and scraped some of it with my fingernail. It flaked off dry and dark reddish brown. I'd worked in a warehouse where a guy had dropped a pallet on his foot and bled all over the concrete. We'd cleaned it up, but it stained. I remembered what the stain looked like after it dried. It looked exactly like what was on my fingernail. I left the house and walked back to my car. The gravel was loud under my feet, and the night was completely still. No wind, no insects, just the sound of me walking away from that house. I sat in the car with the engine off for a long time, maybe 30 minutes, just staring through the windshield at the dark shape of the building. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. I wiped the residue off my nail onto my jeans, and then I just sat there. The smart thing, the obvious thing, would have been to call the police. I knew that, but I also knew what I'd sound like. I was a guy with tax problems and no permanent address who'd been working under the table for a man the whole town loved, and my evidence was a dark smudge on a piece of wood in a house I'd entered without permission. They'd think I was crazy, or lying, or trying to cause trouble. And if Glenn found out I'd gone to the cops, and he would find out because Dalton was the kind of town where everything got back to everyone, then what? If I was right about him, I'd just made myself a target. If I was wrong, I'd burned the only job I had for nothing. So I didn't call. Another thing I'm not proud of. I decided I needed real evidence. Something undeniable. Something that couldn't be explained away with burst pipes or feral dogs. I didn't have a plan exactly. I just knew I needed to see what was in that storage unit. Glenn went to the unit on a Thursday night, like he often did. I knew his schedule well enough by then to predict it. I waited until the next day, Friday, when Glenn and Ray were working a job in the next county. They'd be gone most of the day. I told Glenn I was sick and stayed home. The storage place was one of those rural outfits, just a row of metal units behind a chain-link fence. No security cameras that I could see. No attendant on site. The gate had a combination lock that I didn't know the code for, but the fence was only 6 feet tall, and I climbed it without much trouble. Glenn's unit was number 14. I knew this because I'd driven past once while he was there and noted it. The door had a padlock on it, a heavy one, and I'd brought a bolt cutter I borrowed from the shop. It took some effort, but the lock gave. I rolled up the door and shined my phone inside. The unit was about 10 by 15. Along the back wall were plastic storage bins, the big kind you get at a hardware store. 8 or 9 of them, stacked. Along one side wall there was a folding table with supplies on it. Duct tape, zip ties, a box of heavy-duty garbage bags, jugs of bleach, bottles of the enzyme cleaner Glenn had used at the ranch house. Along the other wall, leaning against the metal siding, was a bundle of plastic sheeting, the thick kind used for construction. There were tools, too. A reciprocating saw, a hatchet, a set of knives in a canvas roll. I opened one of the bins. Inside were clothes. Women's clothes, men's clothes, all jumbled together. Different sizes, different styles. Some of them had stains on them, the same dark brown I'd been seeing for weeks. There was a purse in there too, a cheap vinyl thing with a broken strap. I opened it and found a state ID card. The photo was a woman I didn't recognize, heavy set, mid-30s. The name was Terry Bowen. My hands were shaking. I put the ID back and opened another bin. More clothes. A pair of work boots caked in dried mud. A wallet with no cash in it but a driver's license belonging to someone named Paul Ackers, which wasn't a name I recognized from my research. In the third bin, there was something heavier. I peeled back the clothes on top, and underneath them was a collection of personal items. Cell phones, rings, watches, a couple of sets of keys, dozens of items. Each one had belonged to a person. I didn't open the rest of the bins. I stood in that storage unit, and the scale of it settled over me like something physical, like the air had changed weight. This wasn't 1 or 2 people. This was something Glenn had been doing for a long time, maybe years, and he'd gotten comfortable with it. The supplies on the table, the efficiency of the setup, the sheer volume of belongings. This was practiced. This was routine. I closed the bins and put everything back the way I'd found it. I replaced the lock with a new one I'd brought that looked similar. I climbed the fence and drove home and sat in Marcus's bathroom with the door locked and threw up. I should have called the police then. Right then, with the specific details of what I'd seen and where. I know that. But I was scared in a way I'd never been scared before. Not the adrenaline kind of scared, but the deep, bone-level kind that makes you feel like the ground isn't solid anymore. Glenn knew where I lived. Glenn knew my cousin. Glenn knew everything about me because I'd spent weeks riding in his truck and talking to him like he was a normal human being. And I'd participated in the cleanups. My fingerprints were in those houses. My DNA was probably mixed in with whatever evidence was left. If this came to light, I wouldn't just be a witness. I'd be a suspect. I decided to leave. Just pack my stuff and go. Drive back to Columbus or anywhere else and put Dalton behind me. I could call in a tip from a payphone 100 miles away and let someone else deal with it. That was my plan. That was the smart play. I was packing my bag the next morning when Glenn called. "Feeling better?" he asked. He sounded normal, cheerful even. I said, "Yeah, I was." "Good. I need you tonight." "Got a job?" My mouth went dry. "Side job?" "Yeah. Just you and me. Pick you up at 9. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him I was leaving town. But something in his voice, or maybe something I imagined in his voice, stopped me. If I said no now, after never refusing before, he'd wonder why. And if he went to his storage unit and found the new lock, he'd know why. "Yeah, okay," I said. I hung up and sat on the bed. My bag was half packed on the floor. I had about 6 hours before Glenn would come. I could be long gone by then. I could leave right now. But I didn't leave. And the reason I didn't leave was because I kept thinking about the bins full of belongings. The phones that would never ring again. The ID belonging to Terry Bowen, whose family probably still checked their mailbox every day, hoping for some kind of news. I thought about Paul Ackers and whoever else was in those bins. People who'd been reduced to a pile of objects in a metal box because they were vulnerable and alone, and no one was looking for them hard enough. If I left, Glenn would keep going. He'd keep picking people nobody would miss. He'd keep calling Ray for the heavy lifting and finding some other desperate guy to help with the side jobs. And I'd spend the rest of my life knowing I ran away. So I stayed, and I went to the police. I drove to the county sheriff's office, not the one in Dalton where Glenn was friends with the sheriff, but the county seat 30 minutes east. I asked to speak to a detective. They put me in a small room with a table and 2 chairs, and a woman came in. Detective Rourke, mid-40s, serious face, hair pulled back. She sat down and asked what I wanted to report. I told her everything. Every job, every stain, every explanation Glenn had given me. The shoe in the wall, the storage unit, the bins, Terry Bowen's ID. I talked for almost an hour. Rourke took notes and didn't interrupt. When I was done, she asked me a few questions. How long I'd been working for Glenn? Did I have any documentation? Had I told anyone else? I answered everything honestly, including the parts that made me look bad. She left the room for about 20 minutes. When she came back, she had another detective with her, a younger guy named Harmon. They asked me to go through it again. I did. They asked if I'd be willing to wear a wire. I said no. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I was afraid Glenn would check and I'd end up in one of those bins. Rourke said they would look into it. She said I should go home and act normal and not do anything to tip Glenn off. She said they'd be in touch. She asked me not to leave town. I drove back to Dalton feeling like I'd swallowed a fistful of glass. Acting normal. Sure. No problem. Glenn picked me up that night in his truck. Ray wasn't there. It was just the 2 of us, driving down dark county roads with the radio playing country music and Glenn humming along. He was in a good mood. He told me about a deck job he'd lined up for the following week, a big one that would keep us busy for a while. He asked me how things were going with April. Normal conversation. The kind of thing we always talked about. We pulled off the main road onto a dirt track that wound through heavy woods. After about a mile, the trees opened up into a small clearing where there was a house. More of a cabin, really. Single story. No lights on. Glenn parked and turned off the engine. Owner's been using this as a rental, he said. Off the books. Tenant trashed the place and split. We're cleaning it out. I nodded. My heart was going fast, but I kept my breathing steady. Just another side job. Act normal. We went inside and it was what I expected. The same kind of scene as the others. The same smells. The same stains. But this time there was more. The bathroom had been wrecked. The mirror smashed. Tiles pulled off the wall. There were drag marks on the hallway floor. Long dark smears that led from the bathroom to the back door. And in the kitchen, on the counter next to the sink, there was a length of rope. The kind you buy at any hardware store. Coiled neatly like someone had taken care with it. I stood in the kitchen staring at that rope and Glenn came in behind me. "Start in the bathroom," he said. "I'll bag the loose stuff." I went to the bathroom and started pulling up the floor. My hands were shaking. The linoleum was saturated with dried blood. I knew what it was now. I wasn't pretending anymore. Under the linoleum, the plywood subfloor was so soaked it had warped and darkened to almost black in places. Someone had lost a tremendous amount of blood in this room. I tore it up and bagged it, and tried not to think about whose blood it was. We worked for 3 hours. Glenn talked the whole time, stories about his ex-wife, about a truck he was thinking of buying, about the weather. I gave one-word answers, and he didn't seem to notice or care. When we were done, we loaded the truck and drove to a spot I hadn't been before, a property Glenn owned about 10 miles south of town. There was a large hole dug in the ground behind a barn, maybe 10 feet deep and 20 feet across. We dumped everything in, carpet, drywall, flooring, all of it. Glenn poured something from a jug over the pile. It smelled like kerosene. "We'll burn it tomorrow," he said. "Stuff needs to dry out first." On the drive back, Glenn was quiet for a while. Then he said, "You're a good worker. Most guys can't handle the night stuff. They get squeamish." "I need the money," I said. Glenn laughed. "That's what I like about you. No drama." He dropped me off and I went inside and sat in the dark in Marcus's kitchen. I didn't turn on the light. I just sat there, hands flat on the table, breathing. The next 3 days were the longest of my life. I went to work and did regular jobs with Glenn and Ray and acted like nothing was wrong. I smiled when Glenn smiled. I nodded when Ray nodded. I ate lunch and drank water and operated power tools and pretended I was the same person I'd been a month ago. Every night I checked my phone for a call or message from Detective Rourke. Nothing came. The hardest part was the truck rides. Glenn always drove and I sat shotgun, and there was nowhere to look except forward or at him. He'd talk and I'd respond, and the whole time my brain was churning through what I knew about the man sitting 2 feet away from me. I'd watch his hands on the steering wheel, those thick, calloused hands, and try not to think about what they'd done. He'd turn to me and smile about something, and I'd smile back, and it felt like my face was a mask I was holding in place with every muscle I had. At lunch on the second day, Glenn handed me a sandwich his girlfriend had made, ham and cheese on white bread, wrapped in foil. I ate it because not eating it would have been strange. It tasted like nothing. On the 4th day, I called the sheriff's office. The receptionist said Rourke was out and took a message. Rourke didn't call back. I called again the next day and got Harmon, the younger detective. He said they were working on it, that these things take time, that I should sit tight. He sounded distracted, like I was one of 30 things on his desk. I was running out of patience and time. I could feel it in the way Glenn looked at me, or maybe I was imagining it. But there were moments, just flickers, where his eyes would rest on me a beat too long, or he'd ask a question and watch my face while I answered like he was measuring something. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, but paranoia felt justified at that point. On a Monday night, Glenn called and asked me to come to the shop. Not for a job. He said he wanted to talk about scheduling for the week. That was unusual. Glenn usually just told us what we were doing each morning. But I went because saying no would be worse. When I got to the shop, both trucks were there. The bay lights were on. I walked in through the side door and Glenn was sitting on a workbench near the back, legs dangling. Ray was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed. "Close the door," Glenn said. I closed it. Glenn looked at me and the friendliness was gone from his face. Not anger exactly. Something worse. He looked tired and resigned, like a man who'd come to a decision he didn't want to make. "Someone cut the lock on my storage unit," he said. My blood went cold. I'd replaced it. I'd put a new lock on. But I guess the new lock didn't match the old one well enough. Or Glenn had marked his somehow. Or he just noticed it was different. I don't know. It doesn't matter. "I don't know what you think you found in there," Glenn continued. "But I need to know who you've talked to." "I haven't talked to anyone," I said. My voice came out steady, which surprised me. "Don't lie to me." He said it quietly. "I've been patient with you. I've been fair. But I need the truth right now." Ray hadn't moved. He was watching me with those deep-set eyes, his face completely blank. I noticed his hands weren't crossed anymore. His right hand was behind his back. "Glenn, I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "I've never been to your storage unit. I don't even know where it is." "Sure." Glenn hopped off the workbench. He was a big man, over 6 feet and probably 220, and when he stood I was reminded how much larger than me he was. "Okay, let me put it to you another way. You've been working for me for about 2 months. You've been on a lot of my jobs. If someone were to look into those properties, they'd find evidence of your involvement right alongside mine. Your prints, your sweat, maybe your hair. You're not a bystander in this. You're part of it." "I didn't know what any of that was," I said. "Maybe not at first, but you kept coming back. You took the money. At what point did you figure it out?" I didn't answer. My eyes were on Ray's hand behind his back. Glenn followed my gaze and shook his head. "Ray, relax." Ray didn't relax. He brought his hand around and he was holding a claw hammer, not gripping it like he was about to use it, just holding it at his side. But the message was clear. "Here's what's going to happen," Glenn said. "You're going to come with us tonight. We've got a job, a real one. And then you and I are going to have a more detailed conversation about what comes next." "I'll pass," I said. Glenn's jaw tightened. "That's not one of the options." I took a step toward the door. Ray moved at the same time, fast for a guy who always seemed half asleep. He crossed the distance between us in 3 strides and swung the hammer. He wasn't aiming for my head. He hit my left shoulder, right on the collarbone. The pain was instant and total, a white flash that wiped out everything else. I dropped to one knee and my arm went dead. I heard myself make a sound, a grunting scream that I didn't recognize as my own voice. Glenn grabbed me by the collar of my jacket and hauled me up. He was strong. He lifted me like I weighed nothing and shoved me against the wall. My head bounced off the metal siding and my vision blurred. "I told you," he said, his face close to mine. "No drama." Ray hit me again, this time in the ribs. I heard something crack. The pain folded me over and Glenn let go and I dropped to the concrete floor. I couldn't breathe. Every attempt to inhale sent a grinding agony through my side that made my eyes water. Glenn crouched down next to me. "I didn't want this," he said. He sounded almost sincere. "You were a good kid. You worked hard. All you had to do was keep your mouth shut and do your job. I was on the ground, gasping, my left arm useless and my ribs broken. Ray stood over me with the hammer, and Glenn was crouched beside me, and I understood with perfect clarity that I was going to die in this shop, unless something changed in the next few seconds. My right hand was on the concrete floor, and under my palm I felt something. A loose bolt, maybe half an inch in diameter, the kind that falls off equipment and rolls into corners. I closed my fingers around it. It wasn't a weapon. It was barely anything. But it was something in my hand when I had nothing else. Glenn stood up and turned to Ray. "Get the truck started. We'll take him out to the..." I threw the bolt at Glenn's face as hard as I could from the ground. It hit him in the eye. Not perfectly, not like in a movie, but enough. It caught him on the brow and the eye socket, and he flinched backward with his hand going to his face, and for 1 second neither of them was ready for me to move. I rolled sideways and got my right hand on the leg of the workbench and pulled myself up. The pain in my ribs was unbearable, but I was standing. On the workbench behind me were tools, Glenn's tools, the ones he used every day. My hand found the handle of a utility knife, and I pulled it off the bench and extended the blade in one motion. Ray came at me with the hammer raised. He swung and I ducked under it, and the hammer hit the workbench with a clang that rang through the whole building. I drove the utility knife into his stomach. It went in easier than I expected. The blade was fresh and sharp, only about an inch long, but it sank into the soft flesh below his navel, and I dragged it sideways before he could pull away. Ray made a sound like all the air was going out of him at once. He stumbled back and looked down at himself, and the front of his shirt was turning dark. He dropped the hammer and pressed both hands against the wound. Glenn was coming at me, one eye shut and streaming tears, his big hands reaching. I slashed at him with the knife and caught him across the forearm. He didn't stop. He grabbed my jacket again and threw me sideways, and I went down hard on my bad shoulder, and the pain was so intense I almost blacked out. He kicked me in the ribs, right where they were broken. Something shifted inside me that shouldn't have shifted, and I felt a wet, grinding sensation that made me scream. He kicked me again, and again. "You stupid kid," he said. He wasn't yelling. He was breathing hard, and his voice was strained but controlled. "You stupid, ungrateful kid." I still had the knife. My hand had locked around it in some automatic survival reflex that I had no conscious control over. When Glenn leaned down to grab me again, I swung it upward, and the blade caught him under the chin. It sank into the soft tissue of his throat, just below the jaw. I felt it go through skin and fat and muscle, and Glenn made a gurgling sound and jerked back, and the knife came with him, still embedded. He staggered, hands going to his neck, and blood began to pour down his chest in a heavy, steady stream, much more blood than I'd ever seen come out of a person. It was dark and thick, and it came in pulses that matched his heartbeat. He fell against the workbench and then slid to the floor. His legs kicked for a few seconds, these terrible involuntary spasms, and his hands kept grabbing at the knife handle, but his fingers were slippery with blood and couldn't get a grip. The gurgling sound got wetter and weaker. His eyes were open and they found mine, and I saw something in them that I've never been able to name. Not fear exactly. More like bewilderment. Like he genuinely couldn't believe this was how it ended for him. It took about 2 minutes. That's a long time to watch someone die. It felt longer. Ray was on the floor by the far wall, still pressing his hands against his stomach. There was a pool of blood beneath him that was slowly spreading. He was conscious, looking at me. His face was gray. I got up. It took everything I had. My left arm was hanging wrong. My ribs were grinding with every breath, and I could taste blood in the back of my throat. I found my phone in my pocket and called 911. I gave them the address of the shop and told them there were 2 men down and that I needed an ambulance. The dispatcher asked me to stay on the line. I sat down on the concrete floor, about 10 feet from Glenn's body, and I stayed on the line. Ray died before the ambulance got there. The wound I'd given him had cut into something vital, an artery maybe, and he just slowly went gray and stopped breathing. His eyes stayed open. I didn't try to help him. I know what that says about me. But I'd seen what was in those bins, and I'd seen those drag marks on the floor, and I couldn't bring myself to save the life of a man who'd helped end so many. The paramedics arrived first, then the sheriff's deputies, then more deputies, then state police. The shop filled with people and noise and flashing lights. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders like I was a trauma victim in a movie, which I suppose I was. A paramedic shined a light in my eyes and asked me questions, and I answered them, but I don't remember what I said. I remember the concrete was cold against my legs, and there was blood on my hands and forearms that had started to dry and tighten on my skin. I remember a deputy looking at Glenn's body, and then looking at me, and his expression shifting through several things, before settling on something careful and neutral. They took me to the hospital and set my collarbone and wrapped my ribs, and a doctor told me I was lucky the broken rib hadn't punctured my lung. I stayed overnight. A deputy sat outside my room the whole time, which I understood. I'd killed 2 men. The reasons mattered, but at that point nobody had confirmed any of them. Detective Rourke came to the hospital the next morning. She looked different than she had in the interview room. She looked shaken. They'd gotten a warrant for the storage unit. They'd found everything I'd described and more. In the bins I hadn't opened, there were remains, not intact. Glenn had been methodical about that. But there were bones, teeth, portions of skulls. The forensic team was still processing, but the early estimate was at least 11 victims, possibly more, spanning a period of roughly 5 years. They'd also found records. Glenn kept records, if you can believe that. Not names, but dates and locations, written in a small notebook in a code that wasn't hard to crack. Each entry corresponded to a cleanup job. Some of them were jobs I'd worked. Most of them were from before my time. Rourke told me they'd been working on my tip, but were delayed because they wanted to verify the storage unit existed and get proper warrants. Bureaucracy. Procedure. She said it with a regret that I could tell was genuine, but that didn't make me feel any better. If they'd moved faster, maybe that last cabin cleanup wouldn't have happened. Maybe whoever bled on that bathroom floor would still be alive. She asked me who else was involved. I said I only knew about Ray. She said they were looking into it. She said there might be others. The town didn't handle it well. Dalton wasn't equipped for something like this. Glenn Parcher, the friendly contractor who sponsored the Little League team and donated lumber for the church renovation, was a serial killer. People couldn't process it. Some of them refused to believe it. I got death threats from people who thought I'd framed him. Marcus got pressure from his neighbors to kick me out. I stayed in Dalton for another month after that, because the investigation required it. I couldn't work. Nobody was going to hire the guy who'd killed Glenn Parcher, not in that town. I spent most of my time in Marcus's duplex, watching television and trying to eat regular meals, and failing at both. Marcus was patient, but I could tell the situation was wearing on him. His neighbors looked at us differently. Someone left a note on his truck that said we should leave. April stopped returning my calls, which I understood. The whole town was in a kind of shock, and I was the visible center of it, the outsider who'd torn everything open. Rourke came by a few times to update me and ask follow-up questions. She was thorough and professional, and I got the sense she felt guilty about the delay, though she never said so directly. When she finally told me I could go, I packed my bag the same day. Marcus drove me to the bus station. He didn't say much. I think he was angry with me, not for what I'd done, but for bringing it all into his quiet life. I couldn't blame him. The final victim count was 14. 14 people over 5 years. The youngest was 19, a kid named Aaron Voss who'd been hitchhiking through the area and had called his mother from a gas station to say he'd gotten a ride with a friendly guy. That was the last she heard from him. The oldest was 58, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who'd been living out of his car after losing his apartment. Most of them were people with histories of homelessness or substance abuse, people who moved through the world without leaving much of a trace. Glenn had chosen them for exactly that reason. He'd find them on the road, at shelters, in parking lots. He'd offer them work or a place to stay. They'd go with him because they had no better option, and then they'd disappear into the system of properties and cleanup jobs and storage bins that he'd built over the years. The investigation also revealed that Glenn had had an accomplice before Ray, a man named Bert Kehoe, who'd moved to Nevada 3 years prior. Kehoe was arrested at his apartment in Reno. He confessed to participating in 4 of the killings and gave details that led investigators to additional remains buried on properties Glenn owned. I testified at Kehoe's trial 8 months later. The courtroom was in Columbus, which felt strange, being back in the city I'd left. I wore a suit Marcus's neighbor had lent me and sat in the witness box and answered questions for about 2 hours. The defense attorney tried to paint me as unreliable, a drifter with tax problems who'd worked under the table and then killed his employer in a dispute over money. I could see some of the jurors considering it, but the physical evidence was overwhelming, and Kehoe's own confession had already sealed most of it. Sitting in that courtroom, looking at Kehoe's blank face as the prosecution described what had been done to those 14 people, I felt a kind of sickness that hasn't fully gone away. He sat there the whole trial with this flat, passive expression, like he was waiting for a bus. He didn't look remorseful. He didn't look proud. He looked like a man who'd done a job and gotten caught, and was now just going through the next set of steps. That was almost worse than anger or defiance would have been. The banality of it. The complete absence of anything in his face that corresponded to the magnitude of what he'd helped do. The sickness lives in me now, low and persistent, like a hum you stop noticing but never actually stops. People ask me sometimes how I didn't know sooner. Friends, therapists, the one journalist who tracked me down. They phrase it differently, but the question is always the same. How could you not see what was right in front of you? The honest answer is that I did see it. I saw it that first night at the ranch house, when the stains were wrong and the smell was wrong and Glenn's explanation was too casual. I saw it at the mobile home, when I found the shoe in the wall. I saw it every time. And every time I chose not to see it because seeing it meant my life would get very complicated, and I wasn't ready for that. I think about the people in those bins. Not all the time, not every day, but often enough. I think about the gap between when I first suspected and when I finally acted, and I count the cleanup jobs I did in that gap, and I wonder which of those jobs was for someone who was still alive, when I started not wanting to know. I don't have an answer for that. I'm not sure I want one. Some things you carry without understanding them, and this is one of mine. I live in Pittsburgh now. I work at a hardware store, which is ironic in a way I don't find funny. I have a small apartment, and I go to therapy twice a month, and I'm doing okay, mostly. I don't date. I don't have many friends. I keep to myself, not because I'm afraid, but because I used up whatever capacity I had for trusting people in Dalton, and it hasn't come back yet. Sometimes I dream about the shop. Not the fight, not the violence, just the moment right before it, when Glenn was sitting on the workbench with his legs dangling, and his face was blank, and I knew what was about to happen. In the dream, I always try to leave before he speaks, and I never make it to the door. I wake up and the room is dark, and I lie there and listen to the building settle around me, and I wait for morning. That's all there is to do. Wait for morning, and then get up and go to work, and be a person in the world, and hope that the distance between now and then keeps growing until one day, it's far enough that I can breathe without feeling it. That day hasn't come yet, but I'm still waiting.